Chinese FDI in Africa. This has been a topic of conversation quite a bit over the past few years, and really going back a decade or so, Cobus, we've talked about this. Lots of confusion, though, because a lot of people will talk about all of the financial flows coming from China into Africa, $150 billion of loans, for example, as quote-unquote investment. And there isn't a lot of nuance sometimes in understanding what is a loan, what is an equity stake, what is a greenfield investment, what is a brownfield investment.
And what I think is becoming increasingly evident is that China's economic problems are very deep. They're very deep-rooted indeed. That if you look at China's, for example, its marginal propensity to import, so the degree to which it's importing as its economy grows, particularly in the area of sort of merchandise trade where the global south is a big player, that has fallen by about 2/3 in the 10 years since Xi Jinping took over vis-a-vis the 10 years before that.
The issue of misstating Chinese FDI or like mischaracterizing it in Africa is an old one. I remember for years always being puzzled by the high amount of economic activity that's mentioned, and then when you actually look at FDI numbers, realizing that China is way down on the list compared to other countries like the Netherlands, for example, that actually don't have such an on-the-ground kind of influence in Africa as China does.
The demand from both of those superpowers for more self-reliance and certainly less reliance on each other does present an opportunity to the rest of the world to fill the gap that is left by the other superpower in each case. What, of course, is the very difficult road to navigate is avoiding being forced to choose sides and to maintain your own agency to maximize the economic welfare that opportunity might present to your own population, as it were. So I would be cautious about saying that this Trump re-election is going to lead to a paradigm shift in sort of great power competition in Africa. I think there might well be a case of more of the same.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it has been less than 12 hours since the political earthquake shook the United States, and Donald Trump is going to be president yet again with a dramatic victory that, the fact that he won, maybe not the huge surprise. It's how he won and how decisively he won. We're not going to get into the details of U.S. domestic politics on this show, but we are going to talk a lot about the implications that it's going to have on the international system, on geopolitics, on the competition with China, and specifically on the U.S. Africa relationship, because that is a nexus of the U.S.-China geopolitical competition. Cobus, all day, in fact, you are writing it as we speak right now. You've taken a break from it before it goes out for our subscribers. You're writing your first thoughts, collecting your ideas, again, on a first pass. These are not well-formed ideas, I should say. There's a lot to process here. It's a very complex set of events that are underway in the United States in terms of what led to this decisive electoral victory. What's your thought in terms of the U.S.-China competition, specifically in Africa, related to the return of the Trump administration?
Again, as you say, this is very early days, but my initial thought was that it will probably strengthen two big trends we've already seeing. One is that Chinese technology is increasingly flowing into the global south first, while increased tariffs is keeping a lot of it out of global north market, out of the traditional global north markets where China would be rolling out these kind of products to begin with. They're now frequently going directly to the global south. So I think that's very interesting. I think it is also likely to probably lead to the further, I think, stagnation of U.S. Africa relations. It's been a pretty quiet space. And when we were in DC, there were people telling us, explicitly, both the Arctic and Oceania are now higher priorities for the U.S. and Africa. And I think this is probably true. And I think some of the initiatives that happened under Biden, particularly the Lobito corridor, will probably maybe face some headwinds depending on how things go. But I think except for additional kind of political pressure on South Africa, I think the only other kind of African issues that will draw attention will be the ones where with a strong kind of lobbyist presence, and so I was joking to a friend of mine that this probably means that Somaliland is the South Sudan of the 2030s, which let's hope not, but kind of that is except for those kind of few spaces, I think in general engagement will probably become more stagnant.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the lobby question. By the way, the Angolans have spent a small fortune on lobbyists in Washington over the past couple of years, and a lot of people give that credit for the Lobito corridor and also for the Biden visit that's going to happen in early December. This visit obviously takes on a very different tone in December because he is definitively going as a lame duck president. He has no power. His party is out of power. As you pointed out, the Lobito corridor is now in question potentially as to whether or not it will survive the incoming Trump White House. But interesting about lobbying, there was some news today that came out that very quickly Africa's export credit agency, Africa Exim Bank, launched a $300,000 lobbying campaign to renew the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as Agoa, because they are very worried that the Republican, potentially full Congress, we know the Senate is now Republican controlled, we have a Republican White House coming in, they are not fans of free trade anymore. And so even though Agoa has been a bipartisan issue up until now, there's a very good chance that it does not survive the chopping block. Very quickly, before we get to our discussion with our guest today, Cobus, I want to read you some of the reactions, again, the quick takes that have come out on X, and get your quick take on some of them. Our friend Joshua Meservey, who is a senior fellow at the conservative Hudson Institute, he wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I think U.S. Africa relations will improve as a Trump administration takes a pragmatic approach, and there won't be dramatic changes towards many African countries. But off the top of my head, some potential winners: Somaliland, Uganda, Morocco, and Egypt. Losers, as you pointed out, Cobus, Somalia and your country, South Africa." South Africa is definitely in the crosshairs. There's no doubt about that. Let me read you a quote from Professor Stephen Chan from the University of London, a longtime China-Africa scholar. 4 more years of unpredictability. The world prepares for Trump's return. That's a New York Times article. Only one brief positive comment from Kenya. The rest of Africa is holding its breath. The rest of the world is preparing for the end of certainties. Interesting point on that. And our friend Palami Mutembu, who is the head of the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa, he said African countries such as South Africa have to design multi-pronged strategies that proactively build relations with the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government. Which countries to play an important role in foreign policy? So, Cobus, there's the quick take from a number of prominent experts, some of which we've interviewed on this show. Again, South Africa has to be the focus right now, particularly because of Agoa, but also because of the pressure that just came down for Taiwan to move its diplomatic or its trade office from Pretoria to Johannesburg. Obviously, the support of the Palestinians, and then its close relationship with Russia and China. How concerned do you think people in Durko are today?
I think they're probably quite worried. I do think that a lot of the targeting of South Africa will probably be more rhetorical and performative because in terms of, for example, kicking South Africa out of AGOA, we know that there are also some corporate interests resisting that within the US. So it may be a bit more kind of heat and light, kind of in the rhetoric than maybe a conclusive kind of break in the relationship. But I do think they are worried. It also, I think, Like, sure, like South Africa, perceptions of South Africa being too close to Russia, Taiwan, these things, are all true. But I think particularly in the South African case, I think a lot of South Africans see this as punishment for calling out a genocide in Gaza. And because I think Israel has emerged as being so central to the US election and so startlingly, like the support for Israel has been so bipartisan. That's how I think that South Africans see their own position in relation to this. But, obviously, they have their own illusions,
Well, we're going to continue this discussion about the U.S.-China-Africa relationship in the coming Trump era over on our YouTube channel. We've recorded a live CGSP roundtable with our Africa editor, Geronima, and so that's going to be a full hour looking into this. So head over to our YouTube channel. We'll put a link to that in our show notes if you'd like to hear us, again, just continue this discussion to try and hash out what this election means for U.S. foreign policy, the competition with China, and how African countries are going to respond. Let's shift gears here a little bit today to talk about Chinese FDI in Africa. This has been a topic of conversation quite a bit over the past few years, and really going back a decade or so, Cobus, we've talked about this. Lots of confusion, though, because a lot of people will talk about all of the financial flows coming from China into Africa, $150 billion of loans, for example, as quote-unquote investment. And there isn't a lot of nuance sometimes in understanding what is a loan, what is an equity stake, what is a greenfield investment, what is a brownfield investment. And so for that, we're really thrilled to have on the show for the first time Stewart Paterson, who's a senior research fellow at Hinrich Foundation. He joins us on the line from London. Stewart recently wrote an article for the Hinrich Foundation, How Much of China's Investment into Africa is Real? A very good morning to you, Stewart, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Eric, and thank you for having me on your program.
Well, it's great to have you. Before we get into your article and this question of Chinese FDI, I'm going to put you to the same test that I put Cobus. And I'd like to get your hot take on the election. You are somebody who looks at the big picture of some of these geopolitical trends, particularly related to China. You spent 25 years in capital markets as an equity researcher and a strategist and even a fund manager. And you also wrote a book, China, Trade and Power, Why the West's Economic Engagement Has Failed. So these issues aren't new to you. What do you think, again, just hot take, I'm not going to hold you to any of this, of the implications for Africa of the incoming Trump administration?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, I think for me, the starting point would be to say that it was Trump that really started to push back against China's mercantilism and growing influence around the world, which has stemmed largely from its economic clout. The Biden administration really continued the trend that Trump had begun. And I mean, if you remember in that 2020 election, there were a lot of perhaps more market-orientated neoliberals who were hoping that the ousting of Trump would produce a sharp turn in the American approach to China. But what we really got was continuity. I mean, there were differences in tactics, perhaps, but the broad strategy was similar. Trump's tariffs weren't dismantled, for example. And, we saw a sharpening, perhaps, of the geoeconomic toolkit that America was applying to China to redress the perceived injustices. So there wasn't such a sort of fork in the road as some people thought there would have been. And I'm wondering whether the new Trump administration really will, in the case of the sort of China-US rivalry, not represent more of a continuity, discarding some of the more extreme rhetoric. I'm sure we might well see a ratcheting up of tariffs on Chinese goods and maybe an attempt to apply those to Chinese content more broadly, whether or not coming from China itself. But I think there might be a greater degree of continuity than perhaps a knee-jerk reaction, one would be inclined to believe, just, in the heat of the moment. In terms of where Africa fits into that rivalry, or the global south perhaps more generally. I mean, clearly, if you're going to try and exclude Chinese technology from the US economy. I mean, talking here about, electric vehicles, solar, wind, and whatever. You're going to need to build your own supply chains. Not everything's going to be done in the United States, and the demand for critical raw materials, for example, will go up in America as they're looking to produce these items themselves. So there is a need to engage with the global South out of both self-interest, but also in the struggle for influence. I see an opportunity here for the global South. I've always maintained that America's, and China for that matter, perhaps, we mustn't forget that, they really initiated a move towards an autarkic China before Trump was pushing back against Chinese economic policies. The demand from both of those superpowers for more self-reliance and certainly less reliance on each other does present an opportunity to the rest of the world to fill the gap that is left by the other superpower in each case. What, of course, is the very difficult road to navigate is avoiding being forced to choose sides and to maintain your own agency to maximize the economic welfare that opportunity might present to your own population, as it were. So I would be cautious about saying that this Trump re-election is going to lead to a paradigm shift in sort of great power competition in Africa. I think there might well be a case of more of the same.
So specifically in terms of China's relationship with the global South, do you foresee this shift that it would strengthen China's position itself in the global South, or China's ability to build connections and communities and coalitions in the global South? Or do you think it will heighten other, like multipolarity more broadly? And maybe the question really is like whether a heightening of multipolarity translates into greater Chinese influence or not.
So I think that's a great question, but I would approach it perhaps slightly different way and say, well, what is the core root of China's greater influence? And that really comes from China itself and China's economic rise. I would say more than a function of US policy decisions. And so the next 4 or 5 years of outlook with regards to China's influence, I think, is very dependent on how the Chinese economy evolves from here. And therefore, to a large extent, it's in its own hands and is not a function of what's happening in Washington. And what I think is becoming increasingly evident is that China's economic problems are very deep. They're very deep-rooted indeed. That, if you look at China's, for example, its marginal propensity to import, so the degree to which it's importing as its economy grows, particularly in the area of sort of merchandise trade, where the global South is a big player, that has fallen by about 2/3 in the 10 years since Xi Jinping took over vis-a-vis the 10 years before that. So in other words, sort of national rejuvenation or the China dream, the sort of reorientation of priorities and sources of legitimacy in China away from pure economic growth towards a more nationalistic and holistic definition of legitimacy in China and objectives has meant that China has been, for most people, an incredibly disappointing market to be selling into, given how China's growth has evolved. Not only has the Chinese growth slowed very dramatically, but their propensity to import has fallen. And if we see more of the same, then the narrative which has been such a strong one in terms of cultivating Chinese influence abroad, which is we are the dynamo of global growth, therefore if you don't pin your flag to our mast, you are going to miss out. That narrative is already sounding flat, and it's going to get even more flat going forward as people see that it's not the panacea to their problems. And I would say the same about Chinese outbound capital flows as well, that if what we see from the Trump administration is greater pushback against Chinese exports, and if we see the European Union, obviously with the carbon border adjustment mechanism and what have you, and their own geoeconomic sort of toolkit being put to use against China, then China's export markets also start to sort of shrink. I mean, you quite rightly pointed out that that is leading to technology transfer and greater exports towards the global south and greater economic engagement with the global south as a share of the overall pie. But if that is not reciprocated in terms of the import side to China, then I'm not sure that that is going to be the savior of the global south in terms of their developments going forward.
Well, let's pick up this conversation on exports. Something interesting happened in Ho Chi Minh City right after the election. The stock exchange soared, in part because all of the industrial parks in the north, just over the border from China, sold out. And the idea here is that because Trump is coming back into power, he's going to start sanctioning and putting huge tariffs on Chinese imports up to 60%. He said 200% at one point. Who knows what the number's going to be? That Chinese manufacturers are going to shift some of that production to countries like Vietnam. There has been a dream in Africa for a very long time that it will be the recipient of some of that Chinese offshoring. I think we can put that to rest. But that being said, it may drive some more investment from China into Africa. You make the case, though, that Chinese investment in Africa is overstated. You said that of China's 9,049 overseas direct investments, that's ODI projects, 643 have been in Africa, about 7% of the total projects. And then you refine the numbers a little bit more, and you add a little bit of clarity to why people are misreading some of these numbers. Make the case for us about why the title of your paper, that Chinese investments into Africa is real, question mark. You know, what's the issue here with looking at Chinese FDI and ODI in Africa?
Yeah, so there are two broad categories of issue, I think. The first is the one that you alluded to actually in your introduction, which is that from an economic perspective, there is a big difference between foreign direct investment and debt funding, and also overseas development assistance, which I would describe more as sort of ongoing largesse, for want of a better word. And these numbers can be confused. From a sort of macroeconomic perspective, when one's looking at the virtue of foreign direct investment, particularly greenfield foreign direct investment, the first point I'd make is, it shouldn't be able to be withdrawn quickly. I mean, that's one of the reasons why when one's assessing the risk profile of a country's balance of payments, for example, FDI is held up as being a really good source of funding for a current account deficit, as opposed to portfolio flows that can leave very quickly if sentiment changes. And the other issue with greenfield FDI in particular is that what's implied is obviously that comes with a degree of technological transfer, the expertise and management that go with that, which means that there is a multiplier effect. And when one looks at the countries that have escaped poverty in the sort of post-war era, most of them have benefited hugely from large amounts of genuine greenfield FDI. I'm talking here of China itself, of South Korea, of Taiwan and Singapore, etc., the newly industrialized countries of East Asia. Japan would be another example of that. So it's important to differentiate between funding and genuine FDI, which comes with that multiplier effect. The other category of reason really is about the narrative that vested interests are trying to create about the size of their engagement, if you like, which means that you tend to have big, bold announcements which happen at a particular point in time. And often people just take note of the headline number and put that down in a spreadsheet as being a $2 billion, for sake of example, FDI that occurred in 2016. Even if the project does come to fruition, it will do so over many years. And so that FDI is dribbled in maybe over the course of 5 years or more. The second issue, of course, is that quite often the announcement's made, but then terms can't be reached. It doesn't happen at all. And I mean, that's been reasonably common in the real estate sector, I think, in Africa. Then there is the issue of, well, you have a big ambition to build an industrial complex, but it begins with a small part of that. And phase 2 and 3 might or might not come to, materialize at all. And then, of course, in some cases, what you have is something's slated as FDI. Part of the investment is foreign direct investment, but part of it is really funding and contractual work to put in place the project, whether it's building the plant or the piece of infrastructure or what have you. And then the investor sells out, and that happens as well. And so what my article that you alluded to was just making a point. I just took a sample of, the 10 largest projects that a particular database had purported to, that had been announced, that had been catalogued as being announced. So people make these announcements, these big announcements, they tend to get registered in a database as having occurred. But there is a timing issue here. There's an aspiration versus what is actually planned to initially happen. And then, of course, you quite often get a situation where most of a project is actually to do with the contracting around the construction and the financing of it. But actually, the investment part is then subsequently sold. And so, the FDI is withdrawn. And so, of course, these sort of variations around FDI or purported FDI are very important when it comes to assessing the resilience of an economy and the sort of multiplier that foreign direct investment might be having on the future growth prospects of that country.
Stewart, hang with us for just a second. We're going to take a very short break here just to check in with Njenga Akina, who is our editor based in Nairobi. And he's been following all the other news that we've got going on over on the ChinaGlobalSouth.com website. Let's check in now with Njenga to see what's going on.
Thanks, Eric. While everyone is focusing on what's going on in the US this week, we have been keeping up our coverage of what is happening in other parts of the world. Let me give you a quick rundown on what we have got that I think you and our listeners might find interesting. First, we've got some analysis on what may have prompted Brazil to back away from China's Belt and Road Initiative. Brazilian scholar Tiago Basimo is breaking it down really well in a column in our analysis section, giving insights into this issue. There's also been a lot of activity this week in the South China Sea, where the Philippines has been doing joint naval exercises with various partners. We have a lot of updates on what is going on there in the newsfeed. And in our Africa news section, we break down the third quarter numbers of the Chinese phone giant Transsion and how intense competition from rival Chinese phone brands here in Africa is hurting their profits. All that and more on the CGSP website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. That does it for me in Nairobi now. Back to you and Cobus.
Okay, thank you, Njenga. Wonderful to hear from you. Cobus, this question about FDI, I remember back 15 years ago when I went to my first African Investigative Journalism Conference, and there was all this talk about a flow of Chinese FDI into Ethiopia. Remember the Huajian shoe factory that everybody was talking about, and this was going to be a wave of Chinese outsourcing to Africa. Africans have always presented themselves as a prime destination for Chinese FDI, in part because of this huge, abundant supply of young labor. The problem is, though, is that African countries in many ways are actually not well positioned for Chinese FDI. Very far away, not connected to global supply chains, inadequate infrastructure for bringing inputs in, and then, of course, the power problem in many countries. And then we have regulatory issues and corruption and whatnot. When we look back now at the past 15 years of this dream of attracting more Chinese offshoring into Africa, isn't it time maybe to kind of put that to rest?
I think probably yes, in terms of the narrative that you sketched. What I think there seems to be a little bit more of is some investment sometimes in serving local markets, and particularly like trying to identify local markets that would work for certain Chinese product categories. So, for example, there's more cell phone assembly happening in Kenya now, car assembly and appliance assembly in South Africa that then go to other, within South Africa and other African markets. But it's very hard to say how big that trend is, whether it is a trend at all. Stewart, the issue of misstating Chinese FDI or like mischaracterizing it in Africa is an old one. I remember for years always being puzzled by the high amount of economic activity that's mentioned, and then when you actually look at FDI numbers, realizing that China is way down on the list compared to other countries like the Netherlands, for example, that actually don't have such an on-the-ground kind of influence in Africa as China does. So I wonder if you could unpack the underlying dynamics there a little bit. Like, how are Chinese investment decisions different from those of other investors in Africa?
So I think the gap that you've pointed out there between the hyperbole and the reality is in a way quite deliberate. It is a part of the Communist Party's narrative that China's outflows of capital are producing an altruistic outcome, if you like, of greater development. And of course, that's not entirely fallacious. There are examples of investments or funding which do have a holistic positive impact on local economies. But it really goes to the root of China's political economy versus the example you gave of the Netherlands. China's sort of mercantilist state capitalist system, which has at its core, I think, two policies, which is sort of state control over the allocation of savings and the exchange rate control, and capital control sort of part and parcel of that, which dictate the shape of China's external economic engagement with the world. And clearly, you therefore have this situation where all capital outflows from China either take place through a state-controlled organization or they are improved by a party state-controlled organization, even if they are private capital, private enterprises operating in an industry that is not of any strategic importance. So I think the answer to your question is that, it goes to the very root of the sort of state capitalist economic system that China operates. And the narrative, the gap between narrative and reality, is a deliberate one, that China's economy and news flow around China's economy has been weaponized by the party state. That is why we see a diminution in the amount of data coming out reporting even about China's domestic economy. It's because that it is viewed as a state secret. It is viewed as something that where bad news is detrimental to the party's interests and is therefore deemed to be detrimental to China's interests, because obviously in their eyes, the party, the state and the country are the same thing.
Well, you talked about state-led capitalism, but a lot of the investment in Africa is actually being led by the private sector. Njenga, my colleague in the update, talked about Transsion, which issued its third quarter results. A lot of that is coming from Africa, and they've made billions in Africa. We're talking about Huawei, BYD. These are all private sector Chinese companies that are active on the continent. So moving away from the mercantilist state system that you've talked about into the private sector, what are your thoughts on Chinese investment trends there?
So you mentioned BYD and Huawei are brilliant, and I suppose technically you could argue they are private companies, but they are private companies operating within the construct of the state plan about China's desire to dominate these industries of the future. In one case, information technology, communications, in the other, electric vehicles that are heavily subsidized, obviously, by the state and are operating as part of that plan. So, of course, those companies will get safe approval, foreign exchange approval to invest overseas, provided those investments are fitting with that party plan. In terms of the sort of lower value-added, non-strategic industries, you were mentioning shoe manufacturing earlier or whatever, I think these private companies are pretty free to do what they wish, but they are still subject and operating within that foreign exchange regime that is a key plank of China's economic strategy. And so, point taken. But when you look at the value, the pure value in dollar terms of Chinese overseas investment, it continues to be dominated by either state-owned enterprises, be they national level ones or local state-owned enterprises, or companies operating within the chosen industries that the party state has dictated are the ones that, that China should be looking to dominate.
For people like us who are not experts on, who are not economists and who are not particularly very au fait with investment language, what are some of the kind of main distinctions that you would like lay audiences to take away from your work? Like, what are a few things you could suggest in reading FT, for example, or reading announcements of Chinese investments into Africa that we should keep in mind in order to have a bit more of a nuanced take on these trends?
That's a great question. And I think the first thing that people have to be aware of is context, and particularly context within the concept of the size of Africa's economy and the size of the capital stock in Africa or the global south generally, and how that capital stock needs to grow in order to produce the kind of economic outcomes that we all hope for developing countries. And when it comes to looking at foreign direct investment into any country, for that matter, context is the most important thing. So you've got to look at the overall size of the economy, the overall size of the amount of investment that is happening in the economy, be it foreign or domestic, and the need to grow the capital stock. That's cumulative investment, if you like, in order to deliver the kind of economy that we all hope developing countries can achieve. When you look at it like that, you see that the foreign direct investment flows into Africa out of China are minuscule. So just as an example, we're talking about Africa's economy being just shy of $3 trillion, right? That's its annual output. China's own capital stock, that's the stock of all investment, not the flow, the stock, is about 5 times its own GDP. And yet the capital stock per capita is still low by developed world standards. And China has achieved that through running these investment to GDP levels of 40% plus for the last few decades. So what you have to therefore look at is say, well, if China is putting in $5 billion a year of foreign direct investment into the whole of Africa, this is just a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of investment that is required to lift the capital stock of Africa to a level where, economic growth and the sort of desired economic outcomes are likely to come about. So it's putting those FDI flows into context. Now, obviously, what the beauty of that FDI is that it does come with knock-on benefits in terms of potentially management expertise and technology transfer. And this does make it potentially more valuable than domestic sourced investment. But it's not, we're talking here perhaps a multiple of 3, not a multiple of 100 or 1,000, which is what is required to get those investment levels up. So ultimately, when you look at the countries that have escaped poverty, that have grown rapidly in the post-war period, they've all run very high domestic investment to GDP ratios, which have been augmented by foreign direct investment. So my first takeaway is context of size. The second thing I think people have to look at is this a funding thing, or is this actually genuine FDI where value is going to be created in the host country, where employment will be in the host country, where the taxes will be paid in the host country, and which has the potential to have a multiplier by inveigling that country into a global supply chain where there's potential for vertical integration forwards and backwards that can produce an industry cluster. Because it's where you get these industries clustering that you get this snowballing effect. I mean, you were talking earlier, I think, Cobus, about, the lack of infrastructure to get inputs in and the targeting of domestic markets. And often countries start with an assembly role, but then it's really important that you move beyond assembly into that sort of vertical backward and forward integration so that more components are made on site, more value added is made on site beyond just the pure assembly. And that's where you start to get those clusters developing. And that's what the likes of South Korea during their development phase were so good at. They started with assembly and then they vertically integrated to create dominant industrial clusters.
Well, that is certainly happening in Morocco with the auto industry and also in some of the textile sectors in Ethiopia as well. So a lot to consider there. The article is How Much of China's Investment into Africa is Real by Stewart Paterson, who's a senior research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation. Stewart, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We really appreciate it. And also want to give a shout out to your book, China, Trade and Power, Why the West's Economic Engagement Has Failed. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Again, thank you, Stewart, for joining us.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Cobus.
Cobus, so much to think about on the FDI, ODI side of things. This investment thing, again, is very confusing for a lot of people because they do confuse those inflows of money and they call it investment. And it happens, by the way, across the board. Europeans, Chinese, and Africans, and Americans too, get this all wrong. So I think the clarity that Stewart brings is very, very important there to differentiate between the different capital flows. Interesting, I want to get your take on something, and we only have time for a little bit because I need to let you get back to writing your column for the newsletter. But there was an article that crossed this week by Libby George at Reuters, and she said, South Africa bets on Africa-China partnerships to offset global trade disruptions. And that's an interesting take, and I'm just wondering if you think that because of the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that South Africa really can reclaim its status as the premier hub for China-Africa trade. And I say reclaim in part because so many other places have pulled away some of the South African business. Do you think that the politics and the infrastructure and the market in South Africa is primed to take advantage of this?
It's an interesting question. I think South Africa is setting itself up as a hub of China-Africa trade. I think there certainly are ambitions for that in South Africa. And they're up against some other African countries that are planning similar things. But I think on the South African side, the calculus is also mixed with South Africa's own role as the continent's largest exporter to the rest of the continent. So South Africa is already a leader in terms of trading with the rest of Africa, and South African products are all over, and also like brands are all over, particularly the SADC region. So I'm a little unclear about how those two balance in the South African kind of calculus around these issues.
Well, let's leave the conversation there. A lot to consider today. We're going to put links to this on our show notes over on our website, so check that out. For subscribers, you get a full transcript of today's discussion because Stewart was going through quite a few numbers very quickly. And by the way, you can take the transcripts that we produce every week and throw them into ChatGPT and ask for the highlights and the summary, and it produces a wonderful digest if you're short of time and can't listen to a whole show or just want to extract out the key messages that the guests are conveying. So use of ChatGPT is great with these transcripts. That's available only to our subscribers. And if you'd like to join our subscriber community, we would be thrilled and honored to have you part of this community. By the way, about 25 governments, including the Chinese government, the Singaporean government, the U.S. government, British. We don't have very many in the South African government still, Cobus. I need you to work on that. But we have 25 governments. I counted up all our university subscribers the other day. 42 schools around the world subscribe to the China Global South Project, students, teachers, and libraries. So that's pretty exciting. So it's really a dynamic community, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and your subscription helps to support the work that we're doing to create independent, fact-based journalism about China's engagement in the Global South, which is becoming increasingly difficult to do in today's media environment. So we do appreciate it. And of course, if you are a student, email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll send you the links for the half-off discount codes. Let's leave it there. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject. and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.